One story, one decision. Everything changed. My mother-in-law waited until the turkey was carved and everyone had a full plate before she stood up at the head of the table, tapped her wine glass with a fork, and announced that the family had taken a vote, and that the vote was about me. There were 14 people in that dining room, and every one of them already knew what was coming. Everyone except me. I was sitting at the far end, next to my wife, holding a serving spoon full of green beans I never got to put on my plate. Eleanor smiled the way she always smiled when she was about to do something cruel and call it honesty, and she said, "We love you, Daniel. We do. But the family has discussed it, and we've decided it's best if you're not part of our gatherings going forward. It's nothing personal. We just don't think you fit." And then she sat back down, picked up her fork, and asked someone to pass the cranberry sauce, as if she had announced the weather. What none of those 14 people knew, as they sat there chewing and avoiding my eyes, was that the house they were sitting in, the table, the chairs, the dining room with the good wallpaper Eleanor was so proud of, the whole property at 14, Wexford Lane, belonged to me. Not to Eleanor, not to my father-in-law, to me. And I had the deed and 4 years of bank records in a drawer at home to prove it. Looking back, I should have seen it coming. Things like that don't happen overnight. They build one small humiliation at a time, over years, until someone feels comfortable enough to stand up at a dinner table and put it to a vote. My name is Daniel. I am 43. I run a mechanical contracting company that I started out of a rented garage when I was 26. And which now does heating and plumbing systems for hospitals and schools across 2 states. I do not look like much at a dinner party. I wear the same gray sweater to most family events. I do not talk about money, and I let people assume what they want to assume. My wife, Rebecca, knew what the company had become. Her family knew only that I worked in HVAC, which Eleanor pronounced the way other people say in prison. Rebecca and I married in 2014. Her family, the Prestons, are the kind of people who have always had a little money and behave as though they have a great deal, which is a more expensive way to live than simply being rich. Eleanor, my mother-in-law, ran the family the way a small queen runs a small country, through seating arrangements, through who got invited to what, through 1,000 tiny decisions about who mattered. My father-in-law, Richard, had learned a long time ago that the easiest path through his marriage was to agree with Eleanor and pour himself another drink. Rebecca has 2 siblings. Her sister Vanessa married a man named Brad who sells luxury cars and refers to himself, without irony, as a closer. Her brother Thomas had not held a job longer than a year in the entire time I had known him, a fact the family discussed only in whispers, while they discussed my HVAC out loud. For 9 years I sat at the bottom of that family's invisible ladder. I was the one asked to look at the furnace when it acted up, the one whose career was a punchline, the one Eleanor introduced to her friends as Rebecca's husband. He's very handy. I let it go. I let it go for Rebecca, because she loved her family in the complicated way people love families that hurt them, and because I had decided early on that I would not be the man who made his wife choose. I told myself it cost me nothing to absorb a few insults at Christmas. I was wrong about the cost, but that came later. Here is the part that matters, the thing that turned a story about a rude family into a story worth telling. In 2019, the house at 14, Wexford Lane went into crisis. It is a big colonial in the nicest part of town, the house Rebecca and her siblings grew up in, the house Eleanor's whole identity was built around. What the family did not advertise was that Richard had made a string of bad investments, had taken a second mortgage against the house to cover them, and by the spring of 2019 was 4 months from foreclosure. The bank was preparing to take 14, Wexford Lane. Eleanor's castle was about to be auctioned on the courthouse steps, and the family that looked down on me did not have the cash to stop it. I found out because Rebecca found out late one night when her mother called her crying, something Eleanor had never done. Rebecca came to me in tears and asked if there was anything we could do, and she already knew, the way a wife knows, that we were in a different financial position than her family believed. I had never hidden it from Rebecca. I had only never corrected her family. So I did something I have thought about a great deal since that Thanksgiving. I paid off the house. I want to be precise about what that means, because the details matter. I didn't give Richard and Eleanor a loan and hope they'd pay me back. I didn't co-sign anything. I sat down with my attorney, a careful woman named Priya Nair who had handled my company's contracts for years, and we made sure everything was done properly. The bank was getting ready to take the house. I stepped in before that happened. I brought the loans current, and then I personally purchased the property through a private sale the bank was more than happy to arrange instead of going through foreclosure. The total, including the missed payments, penalties, and buyout, came to $486,000. The deed to 14 Wexford Lane was transferred, properly recorded with the county, and placed in exactly one name. Mine, Daniel Preston, sole owner. Richard and Eleanor knew this. That is the part people find hard to believe later. They knew I owned it. We sat in Priya's office, all of us, and Eleanor cried and called me a godsend and held my hands and said she would never forget what I had done for the family. We agreed, in writing, that they would continue to live in the house, that they would pay me a modest rent that barely covered the property taxes, and that the arrangement would continue as long as everyone behaved like family. I did it that way on Priya's advice. She said, and I remember it exactly, "Generosity without paperwork is just a gift you'll resent later." I kept the paperwork, every page. For the first year, Eleanor was warm to me in a way she had never been. Then something curdled. I have thought about why, and the closest I can get is that gratitude is heavy, and some people would rather resent you than carry it. By 2021, Eleanor had started telling a new version of the story at parties, one where the family had restructured some things during a rough patch, with no mention of me. By 2022, she had stopped mentioning it at all, and when Vanessa's husband Brad made a joke at Easter about how I should stick to fixing toilets, Eleanor laughed the loudest. I owned the chair she was laughing in. I said nothing. I had gotten very good at saying nothing. The rent checks, by the way, stopped arriving in early 2023. Not all at once. First they were late. Then Richard would mention at a dinner that things were tight this month, in a tone that made clear he expected me to wave it off, which I did, because making my father-in-law write me a check for the privilege of living in the home I saved felt small. So the modest rent that covered the property taxes simply stopped, and I paid the taxes on 14 Wexford Lane out of my own pocket, on a house full of people who treated me like the help, and I told myself it was the price of Rebecca's peace. That is the background you need. Now let me tell you about the vote. I want to slow down on the afternoon in Priya Nair's office in 2019, because everything that happened 4 years later at that dinner table only lands if you understand what was said in that room. It was a Tuesday in late May. Richard and Eleanor came in their good clothes, the way people dress when they are about to be saved and want to look like they could have managed without you. Rebecca sat beside me. Priya walked all four of us through every page, slowly, because she does not let people sign things they do not understand. She explained that the company was buying the 2 mortgage notes, that I was then purchasing the house at private sale, that the deed would record into my name alone, and that Richard and Eleanor would have a written right to remain as tenants at a rent that, frankly, only covered the taxes. Eleanor signed every page. Richard signed every page. And when it was done, Eleanor stood up and put both her hands around mine, and her eyes were wet, and she said, "Daniel, I have misjudged you for years, and I am ashamed of it. and I will spend the rest of my life making it up to you." I believed her that day. I am not embarrassed that I believed her. A man should be able to believe his wife's mother when she is crying and holding his hands and thanking him for her home. The making it up lasted about 14 months. I can almost mark the week it turned, because it was the first family event after the gratitude wore off, a 4th of July cookout in 2020 in the backyard of the house I now owned, where Eleanor introduced me to a new neighbor as Rebecca's husband. He does air conditioning. Not the man who saved this house. Air conditioning. I watched her decide, in real time, which story she was going to tell, and she chose the one where I was still beneath her. I said nothing, because I had already gotten good at saying nothing, and because Rebecca was happy that day, and I did not want to be the man who ruined the 4th of July over a sentence. I have a folder in my head where I keep sentences like that one. By the night of the vote, the folder was very full. There was one more thing that happened in those years that I need to tell you, because it explains why I had the documents ready in my mind on Thanksgiving when most people would have been too stunned to speak. In the spring of 2022, Eleanor floated, through Rebecca, the idea that since the house had been in the family for so long, maybe I would consider putting it back in Richard's name, to keep things simple for the estate. She wanted the deed back. She wanted me to hand her, for nothing, the house I had paid $486,000 to save, so that the family record would show no trace that the man who did air conditioning had ever held the keys to the castle. I told Rebecca, gently, that the answer was no, and that I would keep the house in my name precisely because the request had been made. Rebecca agreed. That request, more than anything, is why I never let the paperwork drift. Priya updated my will and my records that same month. I knew, 2 years before the vote, exactly what I owned and exactly why I was keeping it. In the fall of 2023, Rebecca and I went through a hard stretch. Nothing dramatic. The ordinary erosion of two people who had been letting her family's disrespect sit between them for 9 years. We were quieter with each other than we used to be. I know now that Eleanor sensed the gap and decided to widen it, because a daughter drifting from her husband is a daughter coming home, and Eleanor wanted Rebecca home. What I did not know, until the turkey was carved, was that Eleanor had spent the weeks before Thanksgiving on the phone with each member of the family, building what she actually called, to my face, a vote. The dinner was on November 23, 2023, at 14 Wexford Lane, the house I owned and paid the taxes on. 14 people, Eleanor and Richard, Vanessa and Brad and their 2 kids, Thomas and his girlfriend of the month, a few cousins and Eleanor's sister Margaret, who has spent 40 years agreeing with everything Eleanor says half a second after she says it, and Rebecca, sitting beside me, who I could feel going rigid as her mother stood and tapped the glass. I told you what Eleanor said. We've decided it's best if you're not part of our gatherings going forward. We just don't think you fit. What I have not told you is what happened in the 4 or 5 seconds after, because those seconds are when I made my decision, and I made it the way I make decisions on a job site when something has gone wrong, which is slowly and out loud only once I am certain. I looked around the table. I watched Brad smirk into his wine. I watched Margaret nod. I watched Thomas, who had borrowed $2,000 from me in 2021 and never paid it back, stare hard at his plate. I watched Richard study the tablecloth, a man being made to sit very still in a house he no longer owned. And I watched my wife. Rebecca had gone pale, and her hand had found my knee under the table, and she was looking at her mother with an expression I had not seen on her before, something between shock and a kind of waking up. I set down the serving spoon. I did not raise my voice, because the whole effect depends on the voice staying level. I said, "Eleanor, thank you for being direct. I want to make sure I understand the decision. The family has voted that I'm not welcome at family gatherings. Is that right?" Eleanor, pleased to be asked, said, "That's right, Daniel. It's not personal." "It's a little personal," I said, "but I understand. I want to be respectful of the family's wishes. So I'll need everyone out of the house by the end of the year." The table went quiet in a way I will remember for the rest of my life. Eleanor laughed, a short, confused sound, and said, "I'm sorry, what?" "The house," I said. "This house. 14 Wexford Lane. I'm asking everyone to make arrangements to be out by December 31st. I'll be generous about the timeline, given the holidays, but I'd like it in writing that we agree on the date." "Daniel," Eleanor said, and her voice had climbed, "this is our home. You don't get to make jokes like that at Thanksgiving." "It's not a joke," I said, "and it isn't your home. I bought this house in 2019 from the bank the week before it was foreclosed on. The deed is in my name. It's been in my name for 4 years. I've paid the property taxes on it since early 2023 when the rent stopped. Richard knows all of this. So do you. We signed it in Eleanor's office. You called me a godsend. I let that sit for a moment. You voted me out of the family. I'm only pointing out that you voted from chairs I own. I have replayed the faces at that table many times." Vanessa turned to her mother and said, "Mom, what is he talking about?" Brad had stopped smirking. Margaret looked at Eleanor and, for once in her life, did not nod. And Richard, my father-in-law, who had said almost nothing for 9 years, put down his fork and said, very quietly, the truest thing he ever said to me. He said, "He's telling the truth. He saved the house. We'd have lost it. I should have told all of you years ago." Eleanor turned on him with a look that could strip paint, and the dinner, the careful theater she had staged, came apart in front of everyone. Vanessa was demanding to know why no one had told her. Brad was suddenly very interested in being helpful to me. Thomas had gone the color of the tablecloth, and through all of it, I sat there calmly, because I had spent 9 years learning to sit calmly in that house, and for the first time the calm was mine to use instead of mine to endure. Then I did the thing I am most glad I did. I turned to Rebecca. I had not planned this part, and I want to be honest about that. I had walked into that dinner not knowing the vote was coming, and everything I said about the house I said on instinct, from a place I had kept quiet for 4 years. But the next part one said only to my wife, in front of her family, because she deserved to hear it without a closed door. "Rebecca," I said, "I've never asked you to choose between me and your family. I'm not going to start tonight. But your mother just asked you to, in front of everyone, by voting out your husband at the dinner table. So I'm going to step outside and get some air, and whatever you decide to do, I want you to decide it freely, without me sitting here pulling on you. Take the time you need." And I stood up, and I walked out the front door of the house I owned, and I stood in the cold November yard next to the maple Richard's father had planted, and I waited. I want to tell you that I was calm out there. I was not. 9 years of swallowed insults will sit quietly in a man right up until the moment they do not. And standing in that yard, I felt all of it at once. The Easters and the Christmases, and he's very handy, and the rent checks that stopped, and the $2,000 Thomas never repaid, and the green beans I never got to eat. I am not a man who cries easily. I came close in that yard. Rebecca came out after 11 minutes. I know it was 11 minutes because I watched the time on my phone, the way you watch something to keep yourself from falling apart. She had her coat on, and her car keys in her hand, and she was crying, and she walked up to me, and she said, "I told them we're leaving. Both of us. I told my mother that the family she voted on isn't a family I want to be in." And then she said the thing that ended 9 years of me wondering whether she saw it. She said, "I'm sorry it took her doing it out loud for me to stop pretending it wasn't happening quietly the whole time." We left. We drove to a diner on Route 9 that is open on Thanksgiving for people who have nowhere else to be, and we ordered eggs at 8 o'clock at night, and we talked for 3 hours. more honestly than we had talked in a year. That diner did more for my marriage than any house ever could. I will tell you how it resolved, since I know that is what you were waiting for, and I will tell you the part that surprised me. I did not throw the family out on the street on December 31st. I thought about it. I had every right, and there were nights that month I wanted to. But Priya, my attorney, asked me a question that changed my approach. She asked, "Do you want to win, or do you want to be free?" And I decided I wanted to be free, which turned out to be a different and more expensive thing than winning. I gave Richard and Eleanor until the following June, 6 months, and I put it in writing, generous and clear. I told them they could buy the house from me at the price I had paid in 2019 for $186,000, which by 2023 was well below what it was worth, a genuine gift. Or they could rent it from me at a fair market rate with a proper lease, paid on time, like adults. Or they could leave. Their choice, in writing, by June. Eleanor, who had stood up at her own table and voted her daughter's husband out of the family, could not raise the money to buy the house, because the family that looked down on me had never actually had the money, only the performance of it. Richard, to his credit, took me to lunch in January, alone, and apologized for 9 years in a single sentence that I could tell cost him everything he had. He said, "I let her treat you that way because it was easier than the fight, and that's the worst thing I've ever done to a good man." They moved out in May. They rent a smaller place now, a nice one, on the other side of town. I sold 14 Wexford Lane that summer to a young family with 2 kids for $620,000, and I gave a third of the profit to Rebecca's father, quietly, without telling Eleanor, because Richard told the truth at that table when telling the truth cost him his marriage's peace, and a man who does that has earned something back. Rebecca and I are still married. We are, in fact, better married than we were before that Thanksgiving, because the thing that had been sitting between us for 9 years finally got said out loud, and you cannot fix what no one will make. We see her father for lunch every few weeks. We do not see Eleanor. Rebecca calls her on holidays, brief calls, and that is Rebecca's choice to make, and I have never once pulled on it. People ask me if I regret buying that house in 2019, knowing how the family treated me after. I do not. Saving 14 Wexford Lane is the reason I had any power at all on the night they tried to use the family against me. And a kindness that protects you later is the best kind of kindness there is. Priya was right about generosity and paperwork. I was generous, and I kept the paperwork. And the paperwork is the only reason the generosity did not destroy me. Eleanor took a vote at her dinner table, in a dining room she was proud of, in a house she believed was hers. She got the count wrong in the one way that mattered. Turns out it's risky to throw someone out of a house when that someone owns it. I never raised my voice that night. I have found that a man who owns the room he is standing in does not need to. Before you go, tell me this in the comments. Did Daniel do the right thing? Or should he have thrown them out immediately? If you enjoyed this story, please leave a like and subscribe. It helps the channel more than you know, and it lets me bring you more stories just like this one.